sure where I'm going to begin, but I know this much, that I was very happy to come today to speak the Chandrasekhar Memorial Lecture. Because, see, I did not know him. But I was in Delhi at the time that he was active in JNU, and JNU politics is very well known, as all of you know. The whole city watches what JNU does. Very often we don't know who the persons are who are doing it, but we know what is happening in JNU. So those were exciting times when he was here, which of course I realized as a person only later that that this was the person who was spearheading much of this. But when he died, when he was killed, there was a question that came up at that time for us, which is not just not disappeared, it's deepened. There are two things that came up immediately. One is, what is the idea of this martyrdom? Why do people get martyred in various situations, various causes? What does that martyrdom mean for people who recognize the martyr of that person? See, for people who do not care about what Chandrasekhar stood for, he is not a martyr. It is for people like us that he is a martyr. What does that martyrdom mean? What is most closely linked to? And I find that it's most closely linked to the absence of fear. The thing that we find pervasive all over the place now, we are told that we must be afraid. We are told that the world is dangerous. We are told that there is corruption, we have to be afraid of corruption. We are told that there is abuse of power all around, leakages of various kinds. We are told that we must fear that because we are going to lose all that we have. It's all getting lost to this corruption and leakage and whatever. We are told we have to fear terror. And therefore we've got to give up much of our freedom. The freedom is not as valuable as the protection when you're afraid. So there is no freedom from fear. There is the presence of fear, and we are constantly kept with fear pervading our consciousness every day, wherever we go. I mean, now we know, they say don't go out alone, don't stay out till late hours, don't wear clothes like this. This has become very common. But there are multiple other ways in which we are being told, don't do this, don't do that, and don't do something else. Because you may be treated as being the person who did the wrong, and therefore be very careful in how you conduct yourself. If you read literature that's subversive, if you're seen to be borrowing books from a library which are showing that your mind is going in a certain direction, you can be seen as a threat. And you are the people then over whom such vigilance has to be launched. And people therefore have to be watched very carefully to secure society. So the way we are being taught to think about the world around us today is that the absence of freedom is the only way to protect yourself against that which you fear. And you are constantly told what it is that you must fear. You must read some of these Home Ministry reports that have come out of this period of time. It's fascinating. Every year they put out these annual reports in each of these ministries. So the Home Ministry has a report, like when Mr. Chidambaram was the Home Minister. There was one year, particularly when we studied the reports to see, is there really this kind of terror and horror that they are talking about, which requires them to start one NTRO, one National Investigating Agency? There are some 20 agencies that came in altogether. Why do we have so many? Is it really such a proliferation of terror that we need this kind of agencies springing up all over the place? And you find that Mr. Chidambaram, as the Home Minister, has to say that he has managed to contain terror. So he says actually the number of incidents have come down. There hasn't been as much terror activity. Quickly after he says that, he realizes that if he says that, then he's got to cut back on all the surveillance and all the intelligence and all these extraordinary things that he's bringing in. So he says, but to keep this going and to protect this state of reduction of terror, we need to have all these agencies that are going to proliferate. That's the only way to protect yourself against that terror that you have. So when we talk about terror, we are not really talking about an activity anywhere. We are talking about what we have to internalize so that we give up, we cede freedom to the state. I'm often very happy to come to JNU to talk because this is one place where I don't expect to hear the question, what is the big value of freedom? I must tell you that there are many other places in this country where people do ask that question. There might be one person in a crowd who asks it, maybe not everybody agrees with them, but that one person feels confident enough to ask it in public, saying, you keep saying freedom, what are we going to do with this freedom? Does it feed us? When you open the tap, now I'm exaggerating, but when you open the tap, you get water if you they have freedom. What's this big deal about freedom? So there is a way in which the conditioning has happened where the status quo is fine and the state, nobody recognizes, there's no definition of the status quo. So even when we are declining, we presume that that is the status quo. And ceding power to the state is fine so long as it takes upon itself the responsibility of protecting us. Where it doesn't happen, we'll worry about it later. By then it will be too late in any case to involve ourselves in any politics. We will be busy running in and out of hospitals. The question that never gets asked, of course, is what do we do when terror emanates from the state? And when I say terror emanates, I'm not only talking about encounter killings. I'm not only talking about torture in custody. I'm not only talking about false cases being foisted on people. I'm not talking only of the breakdown of the criminal justice system. I'm not talking only about the multiple cases where impunity is deliberately created and sometimes not deliberately but indeliberately because the system has now got restructured only to provide impunity. Well, I think that the latest classical case of impunity came to this land acquisition ordinance. I don't know if you saw the particular provision in that ordinance, which is fascinating. See, when the 2013 Act was passed, there's a history to that law and some of it is comic, some of it is tragic and some of it is just there. And in the comic part, it was that the government of that day felt that they had to keep responding to what was around them. They needed to give the industrialists what they wanted, they needed to give activists what they wanted, they needed to give tribals what they wanted. Not actually give it, but at least be seen as being given all of this so that you can socially engineer a law. That was the logic. So one of the provisions they had in that law, in the 1894 law, you couldn't really take action against any collector or any public official for any action they took under that law. But in the 2013 law that changed. They said, no, we are going, if any official acting under this law breaches any of the provisions of this law, then they can be penalized and even imprisoned. So the idea of penalty to a person, because it meant that you were recognizing that acquisition of land, dispossession of people, mass displacement of people is very serious. And so if you're going to do that and you do that by violating, for example, just to give you one example, it says in that law that there can be no change of land user from one thing to another unless you have completed rehabilitation. So somebody has to certify rehabilitation is complete. Now suppose somebody certifies it wrongly, then they will be punished under that law. Now along comes the next government which has a different agenda, well not a different agenda, different way of approaching the same agenda of the earlier government and in a more aggressive kind of fashion. And they changed this provision and introduced something completely bizarre. See, in the Criminal Procedure Code you have a provision which says that no public official, public servant can be tried, can be prosecuted without the sanction of the government. So the government will have to say, okay, you may prosecute this person, then you can prosecute them. They introduced that provision into the land acquisition ordinance. Through an ordinance, they were trying to bring in the provision where they said, we are going to protect the people who are going to implement this law so that even if they violate the provisions of this law, you cannot prosecute them without getting my permission. Without getting the state's permission, you cannot prosecute the person. So this is the kind of, I'm not just talking about these systems and structures of impunity that are being brought in. There are multiple other ways in which we need to address this issue. The most obvious and the one that Gopal and I have studied most avidly is the UID project. And I've spoken in JNU quite frequently about the UID project and I never tire of speaking about it because each time we find that the absurdity of this project, it kind of explodes in our face. Every time. I'll tell you the latest that we've had, an encounter with the Delhi administration. And that will tell you what kind of a problem we are up against. Recently there was a discussion that we had on three contexts. The context of law, the context of no law, and the context of lawlessness. So when you have law, normally when you think that if there are laws that are made in a society, then that is a lawful rule of law society. That of course is a misconception. That is, it's as much of a misconception as thinking that the National Environment Tribunal Act was about the environment. Or that the Forest Conservation Act is about conservation. It is not. It's completely different. So here, I just need to be proud of it. I apologize, today I've come in a state of extreme fatigue, which means that my mind will suddenly shut down and I'll forget what I said before. So I'm going to ask somebody to remember and just prompt me about where I began. I start a sentence, well then I finish it, I'm wondering where did I begin? Where did I begin?
The National Environment Act.
Yeah, before that. So, okay, this is the last time. I think I'm going to remember all this. So with the UID, I'll tell you the latest example of what happened. In this context of no law, no law and lawlessness, that's where I was. The idea of law is not about being lawful. In the one way in which law is understood is law as an instrument, which means that it is something that is used by the person who either creates it or in whose hand it is given for them to use. This is how we find that over a period of time we have become less and less a rule of law society, because there are various people who control the law and implement the law, and there are various others on whom the law is implemented. The people who implement the law see themselves as being above the law. So they can commit wrongs within that law. The law doesn't apply to them. So this is the classic state of exception. They stay in the state of exception. So whether it's the government or it is their agencies or whoever, they are in the state of exception. To them the law does not apply. But they have the instrument of the law to wield on people, on others, on the other, whoever the other is. So this is one way in which the idea of law has got reconstituted in our setup. So the value of law, we have to visit and revisit the value of law. I don't want to stop with saying that. I want to say that there is a certain value to law, but we have to understand what that value is and how we use the law so that it does what it is meant to do. And what is the law meant to do? It is meant, first of all, to establish basic principles. It must say what is the principle on the basis of which this relationship between law and the people and the law and the state is being established. That's one basic thing that it has to do. There are multiple other ways in which this question about the law gets asked, but essentially it is this. The second thing is, the law has to be something that is of general applicability, which means that everybody is bound by the law. It can't be that only some people. A selective application of the law by people who are powerful on people who are less powerful is unacceptable. Because one of the fundamental reasons why we have law as regulating conduct in automobile is because the constitution and law, the responsibility under that is to protect the weak against the strong. What we are seeing happening now is that the law is held by the strong and used by the strong to strengthen those who are already strong. That is not the purpose of either the constitution or the law. And in surveillance structures, it's one of those terrible tragedies of democratic structures that is able to convert it and make it stand on its head and say that the powerful are now going to be purveyors of information about those who are less powerful. And in that process create further powerlessness. That's what we are standing up against today and saying that to hell with you, we are not going to accept this. This is not acceptable to us. The second situation is of no law. And when the UID is a classic situation of there being no law about it. There is no law. You look, you hunt, you search anywhere you want, there is no law. And it's not just the UID. Even more profound than the UID is all these intelligence agencies. Profusion of them. If you read, of course you have the IB, Intelligence Bureau, you have Military Intelligence, you have RAW, you have these which are Enforcement Directorate, which are all of them say that they are intelligence or security agencies. They do not want to be governed by any law at all. There is no parliamentary oversight, and they have exempted themselves from arbitration. So this is some kind of a creature that has been made which refuses to reveal itself. What can make, you saw the Greenpeace report, right? They can say anything they want. If anyone reading I don't know how the press people, by the way, I was introduced as a journalist, I'm not. I just changed my thing. I do legal research and I do occasional writing in papers, like all of us should do. So Why I'm saying it now is because I'm going to slam the journalists now, and it will seem like I'm slamming myself. But you know, the complete absence of understanding of what they are reporting. You know, the idea that you report as news that which has been said to you, and that's it. It's like it becomes the truth. That's the only way in which truth gets constituted in this whole situation. So when the Greenpeace report came out, there were many of us who were saying that obviously we've not done our job sufficiently because many of our names were not in that report. It shows a failure, failure in some of us, because it was an outrageous report. It's like anyone who's going to question this model of development has to be anti-national. You know, the idea of affection and disaffection, we are finding that they say if there is disaffection, if you act with disaffection to the state, then you're seditious. So you're expected by law and their interpretation of the law that we must have affection for the state. Or you're treated as anti-national and treasonous, seditious, and therefore you can be picked up because what is this that you're doing? When there is a government that says that it wants growth, you are impeding growth by not allowing for rampantly taking over land, for rampantly displacing tribal communities and other communities, for rampantly converting agricultural land into non-agricultural purposes. All these can be construed because of this notion of power. It can be construed as anti-national. And the handing over, I think among the the big difference between the Manmohan Singh government and the government now, the one that I find most difficult to take, I know there are multiple things that are terrible, but it's this patronizing tone that we have. The government will talk to foreign companies and say, we will clear everything for you, please come, put your money into our thing and we will give to Aarti and bring you in. And they'll tell us, clean your backyard, put your garbage in the dustbin. What are we, trying to infantilize us? What kind of treatment is this? So there is something in this democratic system where they're saying, we are going to watch you, put those CCTVs. I think if anybody here knows Arvind Kejriwal, please go and speak to him about what CCTVs mean. If you look at what CCTVs mean, you're going to have CCTVs all over the place. There is somebody who's going to be sitting there and voyeuristically looking at us the whole time. It in no way increases the safety of the person because there are people who you don't know are watching you, who are going to be sitting behind consoles and watching every day. They'll know when you leave your house, when you leave your hostel, where you go, who you sit with, how long you're in a bus, you get off the bus, where do you get off, where do you go. All these patterns of behavior are going to be known to somebody who you don't know who that person is. And if they have more people sitting with them, like I can well imagine, after all, Mr. Modi had to protect that father's interest when he was surveilling the girl, right? So I'm sure there are many other such fathers who want their children's lives to be surveilled. And you're going to have this happening with remarkable ease. Sitting somewhere, because there is one CCTV camera which is what, there are 6,000 or 10,000 or whatever CCTV cameras that are going to be watching people. This idea itself is an idea where we believe that people need to be kept in control. This is a process of social and political control. And that is completely unacceptable. When the RTI came in and we were saying that we want the state to be transparent, I think I was among those who said that we need to understand and nuance the idea of transparency. It's not about everything about everyone, whether they are big people or small people. The moment you say that you're going to make them totally transparent, regardless of what consequence or what meaning it has for public life, then we are putting, the moment people in decision-making positions, even as a matter of principle, I have a problem with it. But as a matter of pragmatism also, I have a problem with it, because if you're going to put all the people in decision-making positions under that kind of transparent surveillance, they will have no hesitation in putting the rest of the population under surveillance. So these situations of transparency have to be negotiated, and we have to understand who we are asking what from. Now, we've not nuanced that. Under the RTI, unfortunately, Prashant has done a lot of work on this, but Prashant has this thing that the panopticon is the best method. He's actually in public meetings in relation to privacy said as much. I'm not saying Prashant's word is going to become Aam Aadmi policy today, AAP policy today, but we need to understand what kind of imagination exists on many of these things. So for those who felt that transparency is a virtue, there was this idea that let everybody be transparent and open to everybody. Like that is an answer to anything at all. And all of us are supposed to be watching each other. So when I'm talking about the UID or the intelligence or any of these other agencies today, I also want us to keep in mind that we've got to think about our own approach to who should be watched, what are we watching them for, how do we understand this idea of transparency, and what does it do to our understanding of freedom generally? Are some people more entitled to freedom than others? Are some freedoms, is it alright for us to forego some freedoms for some people? If yes, to what extent? There are very few things that are absolute. But like I never tire of quoting Kannabiran as saying, when he said that if you read Kannabiran, your reading of the constitution changes in just 2 paragraphs. After that you can't think about the constitution in the same way. So among the things that he says, one of the things he says is this, that in the beginning we had fundamental rights, right? So we all think that we have fundamental rights and there are some exceptions to those some restrictions, reasonable restrictions to that fundamental rights. He says just look at actually what has happened and how we have understood it. The reasonable restrictions have become fundamental. the fundamental rights are what is left over, which we can exercise with the permission of the government. So we have nothing left. Take processions. When you have to take a procession out, whatever it might, maybe on the 31st you want to take a procession out, on 23rd you might have wanted to take a procession out. You have to get permission. And there are in every state between 30 and 40 conditions that you have to fulfill. And pledges in the sense that you have to make, we won't do this, we won't do that, we won't carry this, we won't talk loudly, we won't obstruct traffic, heaven knows what else. Before they will even consider whether they should give you permission. So to exercise a fundamental right, you need the permission of people who have the right to refuse it to you. In the 20th year of the Bhopal gas disaster, people came in from various places and at India Gate they were going to get together and just have a candle, light candles and all be together. So they went to Tilakmarg police station to give them the intimation that they're going to do in case they need to organize traffic or whatever. So then the policeman told them, we will let you know whether we give you permission. They said, no, we're not asking you for permission, we're just informing you. The cops couldn't understand it. Because those times have gone. Now you have to get permission for everything. So we need to figure out what are those things that are curtailing our freedoms and how do we break out of that and bring it back to where restrictions are the exception to the rule and the rule is the fundamental right. We have to bring it back to that. But all these surveillance structures that we are seeing around us are deliberately not just chipping away, but they are hammering away at these very freedoms that we must value if we have to just be human beings. Forget about political freedom, social control, forget about all. Just as human beings, if we have to be allowed to live. If a drone is not to be allowed to hover around and watch what every person is doing, wherever it is that they are doing it. I was saying that there were 2 films in recent times which had the drone in, 2 Hindi films. One was Amir Khan's 3 Idiots, right? And the second one was Salman Khan's Bodyguard. And I said, whatever else they might have, my reading of this, whatever else, I must confess that I'm okay about one fellow and simply can't stand the other. But if you look at when I looked at the film, I said, the tragedy is that this man, his film got it right. Because in The Bodyguard, you see the drone attacking Kareena Kapoor, no? It follows her, it can kill. Drones are, when the Obama administration is told that you've let us down very badly, one of the reasons that it said is because it is after he came that they said this arresting people and doing extraordinary rendition is a very embarrassing thing politically. Because we send them somewhere and then whether its legality will be questioned in court. So don't arrest, execute. And there is a book called The Way of the Knife which tells you how this policy of execution and extinction has been introduced into governmental practice and the way in which this is exercised. So if you look at that, you'll understand how we need, if we have to save ourselves from being seen as threats, who it might be better to finish off, even to begin with, so that we stop being a threat, how we need to conduct ourselves. So one of the things that CCTVs does, and this is tried and tested, I mean it's researched, it's known, is that it makes everyone conform to a pattern of behavior on the street. In a sense, it teaches us to be robots. Because in the facial recognition technology, they're going to look to see if anything looks odd about the way you are. You know, if you're blinking your eyes too often, they'll say, there is something the matter there. Why do you blink your eyes so often? So then you become nothing of suspicion. This whole facial recognition thing is on, you know, many years ago in college we were taught this idea of the reasonable man. For those, any of you who's done law, you'll know the concept. And since it was an English concept, which we just imported in here, we had the same definition. So the definition of a reasonable man is a man on the Clapham omnibus reading a newspaper with a rolled up umbrella next to him. So this is the classical, vintage, stereotypical Englishman. So when a case goes before a court and they have to decide how a person would have conducted themselves in a situation like that, they'll say, what would a reasonable man have done? And if the reasonable man would not have done this, then either you're unreasonable and therefore you should be punished, or they don't believe you and you should be punished. This, and some years later, I did this little exercise of trying to, this is a reasonable man, who's this reasonable woman? And when you construct a reasonable woman, you find actually there is no such thing as a reasonable woman. That's our saving grace. So, but there is an idea, there is the idea that a reasonable woman is a wife. She'll bear her husband's children. Women don't have children. They bear their husband's children. So, there is a series of things like that. And the good thing for, the only people who escape the stereotyping are women in prostitution. This is, of course, this is slightly dated. I don't see much difference now. There's a lot that hasn't changed, where they say that, prostitute women are obviously not reasonable women. So they can't be counted and expected to conduct themselves the way a reasonable woman would. So what did they do? They said, we recognize property rights in prostitute women, but we can't do that in reasonable women. So we have these constructions that we have of people and of conduct. It is this kind of construction of stereotyping of conduct that is being watched through these processes. So when we are thinking of surveillance, people ask me, so what if you don't do any wrong? Why should you bother about this? What is this great privacy business? And I must at this juncture say that I think privacy is an important virtue, but at this stage we are not just talking about privacy pure and simple. We are talking about privacy as personal security. And to a great extent we are talking about privacy as personal security, where we secure ourselves against the state and against the corporation, and increasingly against a global interest that is being shown on knowing all populations. If you read Mike Davis's book, Planet of Slums, it's just a small book. It's a very interesting book. It talks about slums in different parts of the world and what it does, whatever. In the last chapter, he talks about the Pentagon having, the Pentagon has this, it's very anxious because it should be able to monitor what is happening in different parts of the world. Not only should it be able to monitor, in an emergency response, it should be able to enter and to do what is needed in that place. But you look at any slum, for those of you who walked into slums in Delhi, you know that you cannot enter and exit on your own. It is very difficult. I mean, I've been into these cul-de-sacs multiple times, got stuck, and then somebody will have to come and escort me out. It's very difficult to find your way in and out, because there is a way in which these slums develop, where it will get blocked off in one point, it will become a cul-de-sac suddenly, because people, it's a natural growth, it's not a planned growth. So it's very difficult, and that terrifies the Pentagon. The Pentagon needs to know, and it says, in fact, it's interesting, apparently Pentagon is very worried because tanks can't enter these areas. How will you take tanks into these areas? Now, for us the worry is that in Bhopal, they're telling us that tankers can't enter the area to give water to the people who are in Bhopal. But that's not what worries the Pentagon. The Pentagon wants, therefore, to be able, because they believe that the next place from where terror is going to emanate is slums. That's the next great threat. So as we know, the poor are always our greatest terror. The poor have to be treated as dangerous because by virtue of their poverty, what else will they be but dangerous? So there is this stereotyping of the poor as being dangerous, and that's what we see in many of these policies, the multiple ways in which this gets addressed. So, and populations like India, which are, I think our saving grace is that we are anarchic and we cannot be characterized in any particular definable kind of way. That is threatening. Just like ostensible poverty is threatening, the anarchy of populations is threatening. So there is a need that governments, both national and global, that corporations, that agencies of various kinds, they need tame populations. They need to control populations. So that's one whole agenda. There is another whole agenda, of course, which I don't even need to say beyond one word, which is needing to map the resources of the world and for certain privileged access to those resources. And one of the things that you find in that is that you need to know, if you look at all this land digitization of land records that is going on, it seems like a very efficient, very good system. You just have to digitize it, then you know exactly what is where. And even somebody like N.C. Saxena, who at one time understood it from the perspective from which we speak, today says, no, we need to have clean records so that people know where they can go and acquire land. In our understanding, you don't look at the records that are maintained about land for the purposes of making them marketable. The idea is not to create land records which will help it become marketable. It is so that people know what their relationship with that land is and nobody else can take it away from them. When we say, why don't we give them pattas? We're not saying give them pattas so that they can sell it or somebody can come and buy it from them. You're saying that they need to be able to assert that they cannot be sent away from where they are, that there is a certain relationship that they have with that land. That's why we are asking for it. So, but when it comes to this databasing, creating databases, while we might be willing to see a certain kind of innocence in it, where we say that it's a good idea to have good land records, very quickly you will find that this digitization is about figuring out what the status of land is in different places and who do you need to address to be able to take that land away from them. It is about commercial interest in land and not about the interest in land itself. So it's not respect for land. It is about the usurpation of that interest in land. What we are finding is that there are two things that are happening simultaneously. One is digitization of all records, and the second is databasing of everything. And when I say databasing, within that I include the convergence of data. Now I'll go back, because I'll tell you that little episode that we had with the Delhi government. I'll just go back to that for a bit, and then I'll come back to this point, I think, if I could just see, in September 2013, after the court had heard various parties before them who were challenging the UID project, the court said that you cannot, at least for a beginning, while the case is still pending, you cannot make it mandatory for people to have UID for them to be able to avail of services. So this is an interim order. So they said, you can't force them to have a UID. You can't turn them away because they don't have a UID. After the court passed the order, nothing happened. It was life as usual. So they carried on asking for it. Everybody kept saying, what is this? You said that it is not mandatory, but now they are demanding it of us. They carried on. Then something interesting happened. CBI had been put in charge of a case in Goa, where a child, a really young child, had been raped in a school, in a toilet of a school in Goa, in January 2013. The police, of course, botched up the investigation. There was an outcry, and when there is an outcry, what do? Either you pick up somebody and torture them till they give their confession, and then you pillory them and you give them the death sentence. If that doesn't happen, then you hand it over to the CBI. Very often it is the CBI, and then you go through the same process. So the CBI stepped in. Now the CBI, 7 months after the event, they said, we found this random palm print on the wall of that toilet. We don't know whose it is, we don't know when it was put there, we don't know if it has any connection with the crime, but we think it will help us if we know whose it is. So what we are asking, and they went to the lower court and told that lower court that what we are asking is that the UIDAI, they have been enrolling people in Goa. So they have a full biometric database, fingerprints, iris. We are not interested in the iris, but we are interested in the fingerprints. Let them give us that full database so that we can check whether this palm print that we have matches any of those which is in that database. Now the UIDAI panics, and I have my own suspicion that the reason that the UIDAI, it's more than a suspicion, that the reason that the UIDAI panicked was because it doesn't want anybody else looking at its database. I mean, it is, and now it is my hypothesis, and a little more than a hypothesis, that the UIDAI biometric database is a whole load of, you may add your own adjective. So it's just a lot of rubbish. Because if you see what has been happening, you know, if you look at the whole record of what has been happening, you find that it has to be done perfectly, you know, there shouldn't be any wrong in the way in which it is done, and it has to be carefully maintained. We know how this enrollments are happening. And we know that for many of them, this is not going to work. So there is a story to why biometrics has been brought onto this, when they didn't even know whether it would work, and even after they knew that it's not going to work. So it's a huge con job. I mean, it's not just a scam. It's like one of those thriller movies that you have, where the hero will be the guy who commits the heist. So the hero of this project is actually the guy who's doing this full con job, and he's successfully done it and made people believe that biometrics actually has some value. The logic, of course, is that biometrics was only being used in the defense establishment and in intelligence agencies for limited purposes within limited periods of time. Now you want this to be extended over generations, and you want people to come and keep, so their idea is that first you enroll, and the biometrics industry has been interested in getting out into civilian populations, because if they don't do that, their business is going down. And naturally, we should provide the market for them, no? So we are all, our bodies are the markets for these biometric industries. So they come and they are now proliferating. The World Bank has got into agreements with N1 Identity Solutions saying now go forth and multiply. You know, be everywhere. Go to all the developing countries and help them deliver services efficiently. Never mind that your own system is untested and we don't know whether it will work. In fact, we suspect it may not. But never mind, you just go out. And this is a kind of collusion between biometrics industries and agencies such as the World Bank. And we've seen that happen. So when I come back to what's happening here, the Goa, when they went, the UIDAI then runs to the High Court and says, please stop them from taking this biometric database from us. Why? Because they say, actually random prints will reveal nothing to our database, because in our database, you have, for deduplication, you have to carefully take 10, 8 plus 2 and iris. Then when we check all of that against the database, then there's a good chance of our getting deduplication. But if we just bring some random print, we can't deal with all that. So our database is not tuned to be able to deal with that. Second argument, privacy of the people. So they say there are cases pending in the Supreme Court where the court is dealing with privacy, and privacy is very important. The UIDAI says we have to protect the privacy of the people who've given us that data, and therefore we cannot hand it over to anyone. You know, the hypocrisy, it's not, hypocrisy is too mild a term, the complete ludicrity of the UIDAI trying to protect our privacy when they are the first ones to breach it, when they are the ones who are collecting all of this and keeping all the data with them. When every time there is an authentication, they are the ones who receive the data. They know which bank you are with, which insurance company you are with, how many times you've gone for authentication, whether you are getting PDS or not. They are the ones who have all that information. And they want to tell us that they are there to protect our privacy. So the one good thing I'll say is where the Bombay High Court said, why are you panicking? If you say that your biometric database cannot work, there is a Central Forensic Science Laboratory Director. He is saying he'll appoint somebody to see if it works. If it works for them, let them use it. Why are you bothered by it? So of course they ran to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, to give the judges some credit for what they did, they sat on the bench and laughed. They said, are you serious? UIDAI has come here saying privacy? Because all along, they'd been hearing the other side of the story, where people were coming to the Supreme Court and saying, please protect our privacy against this UID project. And UID was coming there and getting everybody else to come in and say, no, privacy is no concern. So this is open lies and absurdity, which is passing as public policy. So somewhere in our understanding of, in our analyzing what this project is about, we've had to factor this in. Everybody knows that continuing to collect, continuing to force people to give their UID is illegal and against what the court has ordered. Everybody, from the lowliest chaprasi to the guy who thinks he's the greatest hot shot because he's done his IAS, everybody knows that this is not permitted. Everybody is complicit in bullying the population. Why? I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer for this, because I think it's a very glib answer, where there partly it might be true, is that it has been marketed in such a way to these people that they believe that it's a very good project and we should push ahead with it. We find when we go back to the first 2006, when we find we can also go further back, but if we were to go back up to 2006 when Wipro produced the first report, they actually say this. They say we have to bring people to a point where they cannot function if they don't have a UID. Every database should have the UID, they don't call it UID there, but the identity number, which will be loaded onto every system. So you should not be able to move, breathe, do whatever unless you have a UID onto the system. Why do they want it? So that's one set of questions. But just to come back to complete the Delhi story. So in Delhi, what do you have? You have been continuing to ask for it. So in 2014 March, the Supreme Court passes an order in that CBI case saying, okay, we agree that you should not be allowed to hand over your database to anybody else. But in the meantime, the Supreme Court has been receiving complaints from various people who've been writing into the court saying, what is this? Supposedly you passed an order saying we can't be compelled, but we are being coerced. So what is this? So the court then, without any prompting from anyone else, itself says that we are receiving all these complaints, so we are reiterating that you cannot compel people. We are reiterating our earlier order and saying that forms, circulars and any other such thing has to be redone so that the coercion goes away. They don't act on that either. So when I'm saying lawlessness, there is a way in which they believe that impunity is built into the system, partly by inefficiency, partly by delay, partly by a certain kind of tolerance of illegality by the state. And it is done by all agencies, it's also done by us. We also expect the state is going to be illegal. And because we have to pick our battles. So we say, okay, we can't be fighting them on every front. Let's figure out where we hit them hard so that they at least, we tame them a little bit. You can't, otherwise it becomes like, you keep throwing through, it stops having any effect after some time. So they know that this is not going to be challenged and they carry on. Now what happens in Delhi is that you have two people who want to have a registered marriage. So they go to the ADM and they say, accept our application. They accept the application and they start feeding it in, then stop at one point and say, oh sorry, you have to have a UID before we can accept your application. They say, why? But it's not required. They say, no, that you have to have, not because, we know that the court has said you cannot compel, but the software demands it. So without that, the software will not accept your application form. So then we said, but then the two of them say, but how are you saying this? I mean, the forms and circulars and anything else was supposed to be redone. Yeah, we know, but we haven't got instruction from our department head, and therefore we are carrying on with this. So we don't want your UID number. You just go and enroll and give us the enrollment identification number. What is the enrollment number you're enrolling onto the UID database? So it's the same thing that's going to come back on here. So they say, no, we are not going to do this. And they say, okay, we'll go to court. Then they say, very good idea. You get us order from the court. So we already got an order from the Supreme Court. What are you talking about? So then, because it seems like they will go to the court, the ADM tells them, please talk to my boss. He's in Shamnath Marg, they're in Saket. They go to Shamnath Marg and talk to my boss. So the two of them go to Shamnath Marg and go to the Revenue Commissioner's office, who's the person who's issued this order. He is not there. Somebody else, there is a lower, some SDM there who says, yes, it is compulsory. You have to give it. Okay, we know all about this court order and all that. We've already filed our affidavit. Let the court judge. After that, we'll decide. Okay, you think we are breaching the law? Go in contempt. Go to the court, and he storms out. So these two are trying to figure out, because they'd already arranged for a lawyer and they would have gone to court the next day. In the meantime, they get a call from the ADA's office saying, come back. Vapas aa jaओ. So then they say, what is the point in our coming back? You said your system doesn't accept it. What's the point? Then aap aa jao, kara do. So then they go back there. And then the ADM tells them, you understand, they've spoken to the law department. Law department tells them, yes, it's illegal, but try and convince them. Then they say, no, they're refusing to be convinced. They're saying they'll go to court. Then he says, acha, then kuch kara do. So ye kara do mein, they say, okay, in that place where it says EID, which is enrollment identification number, they put dot, as many number of times as you require that number to. And lo and behold, the system accepts it. The message we got from that was that they will bully you till you enter the lion's den and hand over your head to the lions, put it into the lion's mouth. But if you roar back at them, then they become little pussycats and they say, nahi, kara. So what do they do after that? But it doesn't end with that. Then, this is end of last month. 9th of this month, there is a circular that they issue. And they say, this is a modification of the earlier order, partial modification. Don't send away anybody who comes to you asking for a service because they don't have a UID number. Please provide the service to them and take them to the enrollment. Really? Then on the 16th of March, the case is heard in court. And in the court, the case of these two young people is mentioned by one of the lawyers in the court. And the judge says, is it a love marriage? And the lawyer says, yes. So he says, well, at least you should be grateful that the government is not saying that to fall in love you need a UID. And then they pass an order. So then there is a further order that these people pass, which is to be sent to all these other functionaries saying, follow the orders of the court. What does that mean now? So that's where it stands. They're going to get married on the 1st of April. I'll come again next month to tell you what happened. but the point is that there is no consequence for this kind of lawlessness by the state. So in the conversation with this revenue commissioner, he says, in Mizoram, and they said, yeah, we know, there are people there who have a problem, that it's the mark of the devil. When the number is given to you, that's going to be the end. Biblically, they believe that this is the mark of the devil. And so we said, yeah, we know that. Then he says, so either people don't agree with it because there is a Satanist perspective. Or, he said, anyway, you're just talking from ideology. So we said, okay, let's talk fact. Have you read the documents which have been prepared by the UIDAI on biometrics to say whether authentication can or cannot happen? He says no. Have you read the Parliamentary Standing Committee report which threw away the bill and the project? No. Then how do you know that this is a project that can work? I am an engineer. So now you have a new kind of God, a new kind of omniscience, where the moment I am an engineer, I know everything can work. And anybody who says otherwise is just saying it for ideology. And the interesting thing about this definition of ideology is that ideology is that which is bereft of ideas. A new definition that has been coined. So there is, what you see in this is the structure of power, where what he was saying was, he said that this is a very good project because it brings everything out on the table. So what do they do with it? When they started last year, 2013, they said we are starting this Annashri Yojana in Delhi. What is this Annashri Yojana? Even as a concept, what is it? See, You have people below the poverty line. People get a BPL card. You get a BPL card only if you, for instance, if there are, when the planning commission, it allocates what the percentage is for each state and each union territory. So even if there are 42% of people in a place who are below the poverty line, if the planning commission says that we are only going to give to 35% of the people or 30% of the people in this state, only 30 or 35% as is being prescribed will be recognized as BPL and given the BPL card. The others will now have to pretend that